All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving deep into the events that led to World War II. We've got excerpts from WWII, causes, events, and players. And honestly, it's kind of wild how the world went from, never again after World War I to global conflict again in just a couple of decades.
Yeah, it really is remarkable how quickly things escalated.
So where do we even begin with this?
Well, you can't really talk about World War II without talking about the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, it was
Yep.
supposed to bring peace, but it might have actually laid the groundwork for another war.
Okay, the Treaty of Versailles. Yeah, I mean, everyone knows it was basically designed to punish Germany after World War I, but how exactly did it do that?
Well, for starters, the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, and the United States, they forced Germany to take full responsibility for the war, which you can imagine was a huge humiliation for the German people. It created this, deep well of resentment. And then on top of that, they lost a massive amount of territory.
Wait, how much land are we talking about here?
10%.
Hmm.
10% of their pre-war land, including all their overseas possessions.
Wow.
Yeah, just imagine a huge chunk of your country just gone. Some of it even went to France and Poland, which, definitely didn't help ease the tension.
Right, so not only did they lose the war, but then they're stripped of a significant portion of their land. That's got to sting. No wonder they felt resentful.
Absolutely. And then there was the economic burden, too. I mean, the treaty hit Germany with these crushing reparation payments, to cover the war damages. This led to hyperinflation, like crazy out-of-control inflation and widespread poverty.
It's like they were trying to cripple Germany completely.
Well, the U.S. did try to help a bit by restructuring the debt with the Dawes Plan.
Okay, so at least someone was trying to be reasonable.
But the economic damage was already done at that point.
Mhm.
The seeds of resentment had already been sown.
So we got Germany stripped of land, their economy in shambles. And then, to add insult to injury, they're limited militarily as well.
Exactly. They couldn't have an air force, no submarines allowed, and their army size was severely restricted.
So they're basically left feeling completely powerless.
Powerless and vulnerable. Which ironically created this perfect breeding ground for extremist ideologies to take root. But before we jump into that whole mess, let's talk about the League of Nations for a second.
Oh yeah, the League of Nations. That was supposed to be like our big hope for lasting world peace, wasn't it? Didn't really work out so well, did it?
Nope. It definitely did not live up to the hype.
Was it just because the U.S. decided not to join? I mean, I know that was a big deal at the time.
That was a big factor. The U.S., they were worried about losing their sovereignty,
Yeah.
getting dragged into more conflicts that weren't really their business. But even beyond that, the League just didn't really have the teeth to enforce its decisions. It's like they had all these great ideas, but no real power to make them happen.
So basically toothless from the start.
Yeah, pretty much. It's honestly a tragic example of a good idea that ultimately just couldn't prevent the very thing it was designed to stop. Which brings us to those extremist ideologies we were talking about.
Ah, yes, the rise of fascism and Nazism. Talk about a toxic brew.
Right. And I think it's important to remember, people were really struggling in the aftermath of World War I. There was this sense of disillusionment. Economies were in ruins. People were desperate for answers, desperate for someone to blame. They wanted security. They wanted a sense of belonging.
And fascism swooped in and offered this, really a seductive solution, didn't it?
It did. Fascism basically said, hey, let's put the nation first. Let's have strong leadership, strict social control, and a whole lot of nationalism and militarism. It was a very appealing message for people who were feeling lost and uncertain about the future.
And Italy was one of the first to embrace this whole ideology, right? With Mussolini in 1922.
Yep. Mussolini's fascist party totally capitalized on the economic hardship and social unrest in Italy. They promised to, make Italy great again, so to speak, restore its former glory.
Sounds kind of familiar, huh? But then, in Germany, fascism takes an even darker, more sinister turn with Nazism.
Right. Enter Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. And they essentially took the core tenets of fascism and amped them up to 11, adding these horrifying layers of racism and anti-Semitism.
So it wasn't just about national unity anymore. It became about racial purity, the supremacy of this, so-called Aryan race.
Exactly. And this whole Aryan superiority thing, it was total nonsense. There's no scientific basis for any of it.
It just blows my mind how easily people fell for it.
Well, that's the power of propaganda, isn't it? They twisted ideas, manipulated people's fears and prejudices. Both Mussolini and Hitler were masters of this, Posters, radio broadcasts, films, huge rallies. They really knew how to work a crowd and create these cults of personality.
So all this is happening. Hitler is gaining power. He's pretty openly violating the Treaty of Versailles. How does the rest of the world react?
Well, initially, Britain and France, they adopted this policy of appeasement. They were desperate to avoid another war, so they basically tried to give Hitler what he wanted, hoping to, contain his ambitions.
Appeasement, huh? Was that really their best strategy? I mean, it seems kind of naive in hindsight.
I think it was a combination of things. The trauma of World War I was still very fresh, and there was a genuine desire for peace. But also, yeah, there was definitely an element of naivete, a belief that they could somehow reason with Hitler.
And of course, Hitler took full advantage of their hesitation. He remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, right? Direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Then he annexes Austria in 1938. It's like he was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push things.
Exactly. And each time, the world just kind of held its breath, hoping against hope that it would be enough, that he'd be satisfied.
But he wasn't, was he? That was never going to be enough. His appetite for power was insatiable.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the Sudetenland crisis in 1938, which really put this whole appeasement strategy to the test.
Right. This is where Hitler demands the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia, but had a large German population. And he was basically like, hey, this rightfully belongs to Germany. Hand it over.
Exactly. And the world watched as the leaders of Britain and France, Chamberlain and Daladier, they went to meet with Hitler in Munich. It was this desperate attempt to avoid war.
Okay, so what happened? What was the outcome of that meeting? Did they stand up to Hitler?
Well, they reached this agreement, the Munich Agreement, and it basically handed the Sudetenland over to Germany.
Seriously, they just gave it to him.
They did. In exchange for Hitler's promise that he wouldn't make any more territorial demands, they went back home claiming they had achieved peace for our time.
Oh, man. Talk about famous last words, right?
Yeah, that didn't age well. Within a year, Hitler broke his promise and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement had failed. Spectacularly.
It's almost hard to believe, looking back, that they thought it would actually work.
Yeah, it seems incredibly naive now. But at the time, the fear of another world war was so overwhelming that they were willing to try anything to avoid it.
It's a reminder that sometimes, even when you have the best intentions, you can still make terrible mistakes.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, like, did anyone see this coming? Did anyone realize that Hitler was just using appeasement to buy himself time and advance his own agenda?
Well, some people did warn about Hitler's true intentions, but they were mostly ignored.
So after Czechoslovakia, was there any hope left of preventing war?
Not really. Hitler had made it clear that he wasn't going to stop. His ambitions went far beyond just reclaiming lost territories. He wanted to reshape the entire European order.
And so that brings us to September 1st, 1939, the date that officially marks the beginning of World War II, the German invasion of Poland.
The world watched in horror as Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks, aircraft, rapid attacks. It completely overwhelmed the Polish defenses.
There's this one detail about the invasion that I always found particularly chilling.
You mean the fact that the German minority within Poland actually helped with the invasion?
Yeah, it's like this terrifying example of how internal divisions can be used to weaken a nation from the inside out.
Absolutely. It shows how complex and multi-layered these conflicts can be. And sadly, despite promises of support from Britain and France, Poland was quickly overrun. World War II had begun.
And then, of course, there's the event that ultimately brought the United States into the war, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But to really understand that, we need to go back and look at what was happening between the U.S. and Japan in the Pacific.
Right, because Japan was becoming a major force in Asia, and that was causing some serious tension with the United States, a tension that would eventually erupt in a way that no one could have predicted.
Okay, so we've talked about, kind of the events that really set the stage for World War II. But what about the people, the leaders who, made the decisions, the ones who kind of had the fate of millions in their hands, right?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Like when you look at their roles in all of this. On one side, you've got figures like Winston Churchill, right? The Prime Minister of Great Britain during the war. He was, completely against appeasement. And he really rallied the British people when things were, pretty bleak.
Churchill, man, he's almost a mythical figure at this point. The speeches, the cigar. Was he really as important as people say he was?
I mean, he was a brilliant strategist, an amazing public speaker. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that he had been warning everyone about the Nazis for years, way before the war even started. He was pushing for Britain to build up their military, even when a lot of other people were still hoping that they could just avoid war altogether.
So he was kind of like the voice of reason that everyone was ignoring.
Yeah. pretty much.
Hmm.
And then, when war did break out, his leadership was crucial for Britain. He just refused to give up, even when things looked really, really bad.
And then, of course, on the American side, you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, right? Leading the U.S. through the Great Depression and then World War II. That's a lot for one president to handle.
It really is. He was a remarkable leader. He understood the threat that fascism posed to democracy, and he knew that the U.S. had to get involved.
Didn't he say something about the U.S. being the, quote, arsenal of democracy, unquote?
He did. And he wasn't just talking. He provided huge amounts of support to the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, sending them weapons, food, all sorts of essential stuff. American support really changed the game.
It makes you wonder what would have happened if the U.S. had stayed out of it. But okay, on the other side of the conflict, you've got, well, these two figures who are kind of infamous, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. How do we even begin to unpack them?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that this wasn't a simple good versus evil situation, right? World War II was really complicated, with a lot of shades of gray.
Okay, I'm listening. Explain that a bit more.
Well, with Hitler, for example, Germany was in a really bad place after World War I. They felt humiliated, the economy was a disaster, it was like the perfect storm for extremism.
Hmm.
And that made it a lot easier for Hitler and the Nazi Party to exploit people's fear and anger.
So they gave people someone to blame, a sense of purpose.
Right. And they were masters of propaganda. Like, seriously, they were brilliant at manipulating public opinion. But Hitler's ideology was also shaped by his own personal experiences. He had a really rough childhood, a lot of resentment over how Germany was treated.
I guess it's a reminder that even the, worst people have a human story. But obviously that doesn't excuse their actions, his beliefs about German supremacy and just this, constant need to expand his territory. It led to the deaths of millions.
And then you have Stalin, right, the leader of the Soviet Union. His rule was marked by, unbelievable brutality.
Yeah.
Forced labor camps, political purges. Millions of people died under his regime.
But didn't he, team up with Hitler at first? I remember reading about a pact between them.
You're thinking of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was this non-aggression agreement that basically gave Hitler the green light to invade Poland without worrying about the Soviet Union. It was like a pure power move on both their parts.
So a partnership of convenience, I guess you could say?
Exactly.
Hmm.
But it didn't last long. In 1941, Hitler breaks the pact and launches this massive surprise attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa.
Didn't someone tell him that attacking Russia in the winter is probably not a great idea?
Yeah, well, it turned out to be a huge miscalculation. He underestimated the Soviet people's determination to fight back. The fighting was brutal, just horrific on both sides, but the Soviets held on, pushed back the Germans, and ultimately helped turn the tide of the war.
So even though Stalin was, a brutal dictator, we can't ignore the fact that the Soviet Union played a big part in the Allied victory.
Right. It's complicated, isn't it? The Eastern Front really weakened the Nazis. There's no question about that.
Just another layer of complexity in a war that was already full of them.
Exactly. And I think it's a good reminder that history is rarely simple. It's messy, it's contradictory. And I think that's what makes it so interesting to study.
We always try to put things in neat little boxes, label people as good or evil, but real life is just messier than that. And I think that's what makes studying history so important. It forces us to think critically, to challenge our assumptions.
I agree. History is about understanding, not judging. It's about trying to understand the choices that people made, what led them to make those choices, and then, what the consequences were.
It's about learning from the past, even the bad parts, so that we can hopefully do better in the future. It's easy to get lost in the big picture of World War II, right? The battles, the strategies, the decisions made by leaders.
Yeah, the grand narratives.
But we can't forget that, at the end of the day, war is experienced by individuals, real people whose lives are completely upended.
Absolutely. And it's those individual stories, those acts of courage, resilience, that really highlight the human cost of war. I mean, that's what makes it real.
Right. We can talk about casualty numbers and all that, but hearing about soldiers on the front lines, families getting torn apart, ordinary people just trying to survive, those are the things that really make history come alive, that remind us that these weren't just events in a textbook, but things that happened to real people.
It's the difference between reading about something and actually feeling it.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the Holocaust. I mean, how can we even begin to talk about World War II without acknowledging the sheer horror of what happened there?
Yeah. The systematic attempt to exterminate an entire people 6 million Jews murdered, along with millions of others who the Nazis decided were undesirable. It's hard to even wrap your head around it.
It's a truly horrific chapter in human history, and it's something that we absolutely cannot forget. We have to learn from it.
We do. We have to be aware of the dangers of intolerance and hatred, because it often starts small,
Mm.
little acts of discrimination and prejudice that build and build until something truly monstrous happens.
It's a sobering thought. But even in the midst of all that darkness, there were these incredible acts of resistance and compassion, people risking their lives to help others.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the French resistance, for example,
Yeah.
or Oskar Schindler saving Jewish people from the Nazis. There were so many examples of everyday people showing extraordinary courage in the face of evil.
Yeah. Like, even when things seem hopeless, there's always that spark of humanity that shines through.
It's what gives us hope, right? Even in the darkest of times, people find a way to help each other, to fight for what's right.
And in the end, the Allies won. The Axis powers were defeated in 1945. But the world was forever changed. Millions of people dead, cities in ruins, and the whole geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically.
It's kind of ironic, right? We talk about World War II as the war to end all wars, but it actually led to the Cold War,
Yeah.
which was, well, another kind of global conflict in its own way.
It's true. It created this whole new set of tensions and rivalries that lasted for decades. But it also led to the creation of the United Nations, which was, at least, an attempt to prevent another world war.
It was. And it shows how complex the legacy of the war really is, right?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer, no simple way to sum it up. It left this really complicated mark on the world.
Yeah. The road to World War II was paved with, broken promises, these really dangerous ideologies, and just a general failure to learn from the mistakes of the past. It's a reminder that peace is a fragile thing. It takes work, it takes vigilance, it can't be taken for granted.
I think that's a good takeaway from all of this, yeah. We can't just assume that things will work out. We have to be active participants in shaping the future we want.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, explored the events, the ideologies, the people who shaped this pivotal moment in history. But as we always say, this is just a starting point.
It is. There's always more to learn, more to explore.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to, keep digging. If something we talked about today really piqued your interest, go do some more research. Read some books, watch some documentaries, and if you want to learn more about specific battles or personal stories from people who lived through the war, let us know. We can always do another deep dive.
Absolutely. And that's the whole point of this, right? To learn from the past, to understand it better, and to hopefully use that knowledge to create a better future.
And with that, we'll leave you with this one last thought. The world we live in today, it's the result of countless decisions made by individuals, big and small. So the question is, what choices are you going to make? How are you going to help shape the future?